Welcome to the Long View. I'm here with Ted Widmer, a friend and a terrific historian and author. And I'm really excited to talk about a new book he edited, little different than some of what you've worked on. And you were the editor for Paul McCartney's new book, Wings, the story of a band on the run, fresh off the press. A fascinating oral history of a band that was extremely important, but many younger people might not know what it is. Anyway, Ted, thanks for joining the Longview.
Thank you, Julian. Great to be talking with you.
So maybe we can start for people who don't know the band. They know the Beatles, but not the band. Paul McCartney's other big band. Uh, what are some of the iconic songs that define their success in the 70s?
Well, it really helped to define the 70s. The historian part of my brain, I have a musician part and a historian part like you, but the historian part thinks neatly in terms of decades. And Wings begins at the beginning of the 70s, or Paul's solo career, which is a little before Wings, and then it ends right in 1980, much like the Beatles, who begin in 1960 and end just like a couple days after the year 19, I mean the date, January 1st, 1970. There were some different definitions, but in each case, the Beatles and Wings is very tied to a decade and huge hits throughout the decade. Band on the Run is probably their biggest album, a song and an album. But Live and Let Die from the James Bond movie, Paul really spread his wings, as it were, and had tender ballads, love songs like Maybe I'm Amazed, which is actually a little before Wings. But this book considers his early 70s solo work to be part of the same story. And just, throughout the middle years of the 70s, Let 'Em In, they're just huge radio hits throughout the decade. It defined my childhood, and I bet a lot of your listeners too.
And how hard was it for Paul McCartney, the period between being in the Beatles, the defining band of not just the 60s, but of rock and roll, one of them, and starting up a new band? How did that transition transpire?
Well, one thing I really like about this book is it goes into the pain of exactly what you're asking about. It was brutal to get through the ending of the Beatles, and it was hard on all four of them, but it was especially hard on Paul, who I think most wanted to keep it together. And if your listeners have seen the Get Back series, Paul's just always trying to get them back on the road playing small gigs or trying to get new songs written. And he has a prodigious work ethic and just didn't want to give up the band that had done so much to define his youth. So to get through that was very painful, and also there were complex legal maneuvers. And for a couple years, Paul was in the very uncomfortable position of suing his three fellow Beatles over what he claimed were bad decisions relating to their management, which he was vindicated on in court. But what a horrible thing to have to sue your three best friends. And the world, as guided by a pretty hostile English music press, was quite happy to pile on and to blame Paul for the breakup of the Beatles for a long time. So this book goes pretty deeply into that pain. And I think it's a much better book for showing how Wings, which is a pretty happy story, came out of the pain at the beginning of the 70s for Paul.
And can you tell us about Linda McCartney, just so we know who she was and what her role was in the band?
Well, part of the success of Wings, I think, stemmed from the success of this marriage. Paul is the last Beatle to get married, and he's considered one of the world's most eligible bachelors. And then he ends up surprisingly with an American woman who's a divorcee with a child, and they have a fantastic family. They raise their kids. Sometimes they go to Scotland to get away from London, but they also live around London a lot. And one of the more amazing parts of this story is his success at integrating his wife and also his kids, who traveled with them on many of their road trips. into the story of Wings, which is almost unique in the history of rock and roll. There just are not very many successful family stories or even husbands and wives in the same band, but they pulled it off.
And of course, this is in the shadow. I was thinking of this as I was reading the interviews of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's relationship, often being blamed for
Right.
the downfall of the Beatles. And here he is starting a band with his significant other.
And I mean, all of it is fascinating. John and Yoko get married within days of when Paul and Linda get married, and it's as if they're transferring the intense friendship they had for each other into these new relationships that are profoundly important to each Beatle, to John and to Paul. And, all four Beatles had very strong marriages. Not all of them survived, but they were important as the band was breaking up. And I think what Linda and Paul had was really remarkable. That was one of my big takeaways from doing this research.
And they were a huge band. They were playing arenas at a scale that other bands couldn't do. And you make an argument, or the book makes an argument that they were consequential, that they kind of had an
Yes.
impact on rock and roll. Can you explain how so?
Yeah, I think there have been some misunderstandings or maybe even deliberate misrepresentations of Wings ever since the 70s when the critics really came out with their knives sharpened for Wings. I mentioned how people blamed Paul for the breakup. And everyone knows he has a talent for poppy songs, for sometimes sentimental, sometimes not sentimental, but catchy melodies. And the mood of the 70s was much more looking for edgy stuff for a long time. I mean, hard rock is getting big in the 70s, and John Lennon is always doing, not always, but often more political rock and roll than Paul. So Paul suffered in comparison, but the people loved the music. They bought the singles, they bought the LPs, and Wings quickly becomes one of the top bands in the world. Their first album is a little slow. I mean, I consider McCartney 1 and Ram to be part of this story. Ram is Paul and Linda with a drummer, Denny Seiwell, who will later be in Wings. But then the first couple Wings albums are some modest successes with the public, but then Band on the Run is just a huge global phenomenon, number one. And they ride that for a long time. Venus and Mars is very big. And then in 1976, the bicentennial year, they have an epic tour across the United States called Wings Over America. That, in many ways, this was news to me, helped to define what arena rock would become. They took it to a level the Beatles had never been at, with bigger crowds and more sophisticated ways of getting the sounds of a rock concert to a huge sports arena, better monitors, better light displays. And so he was still a pioneer in important ways throughout the 70s.
And who was Denny Lane?
Denny Lane is a friend from the 60s. He's from Birmingham, and not too far, not the same city as Liverpool, but they're Northerners in a way. Birmingham, not quite as far north, but he was in the Moody Blues, and the Beatles admired the Moody Blues. They were a pretty experimental band in a lot of ways. They had chart successes, but they were interesting. And so Paul needs someone like John, a singer, guitarist, songwriter, and Denny Lane and he get together and they start practicing and they like each other. And Denny stays with Wings all the way to the end, all the way to 1980/81 when they finally call it a day. And that's important because, like Spinal Tap, there are some drummer mishaps and changes in personnel along the way. So the fact that Denny stays for as long as he does, I think, was very important to the success of Wings.
And what did John Lennon think of the band? Do we know?
Well, we do have some quotes. So it's the book is a pastiche of quotes. You correctly said it's an oral history, and many are from a forthcoming documentary that's coming out in February 26th. But I ransacked old music magazines and books about the Beatles and books about the Beatles after the breakup of the Beatles. And John was really quite complimentary. I mean, the story that is a little bit newsier is how John and Paul were angry at each other for a couple years after the breakup, and they wrote nasty songs about each other. Um, Paul wrote a song called "Too Many People," which is clearly poking fun and a little maybe with some real anger at John and Yoko and their preachiness. And then John responded with a blistering attack on Paul called "How Do You Sleep?" which took it even to a higher level. But underneath it all, I found lots of quotes about how John really appreciated Paul's musical directions. And in addition to the John quotes I found, there are amazing quotes from Sean Lennon, John's son, about how the specific albums of Wings that John owned were clearly played. There's a lot of wear and tear on those LPs. So Sean just said, we all loved Wings. And the story of the tension was a bit overwrought, and the truth was they always loved each other, and they were coming back toward each other in important ways at the end of the decade.
By the way, you said earlier that they kind of made arena rock what it is. What is arena rock to you? What makes that distinct? Just
Well,
bigness or something else?
a simple definition would be a sports stadium, and the Beatles did do that. They played twice at Shea Stadium baseball park, but I think even more, it's an enclosed concrete, sort of domed stadium, usually in a suburb with lots of parking spots. And the enclosed nature of the room means it's possible to get speakers all around the room the sound at Shea Stadium was terrible, but they're figuring it out much better in the 70s. And so these are big shows, 40,000, 50,000 people. I think one of Paul's shows was in Seattle, and it was up around 60 or 70,000, which was more than the Beatles had at Shea Stadium. So they're immersive environments in a sonic way, but also just so many people together. They were special events that were at a higher level than what was available in the 60s.
And even obviously, the parking lot becomes a site of
Exactly.
festivity and community
Exactly.
gathering, which you can see to this day if you go to any other band. Um, what was the critical reception to them? I mean, like Rolling Stone magazine, what were they writing about Wings at the time?
They're pretty snarky. When Ram comes out, which is a great album. I mean, people can disagree, but I think it's a tremendous album. And I think the critical consensus has come around to support that view. But John Landau, who was a critic for Rolling Stone, was devastating, called it something like a mountain of insignificance and pompous and self-indulgent. There are all these words that rock critics like to apply to a big star like Paul. But the people bought Ram and in huge numbers. And when Paul proved beyond any doubt that Wings were here to stay, and I think that proof really, well, the Band on the Run album in 1973, and then the Wings Over America tour in 1976, I think even Rolling Stone had to admit he's a serious person in our cultural life. And what has happened since then is remarkable. I mean, he's arguably at the peak of his powers as far as drawing people to concerts. He plays these 3-hour shows. He's 83 years old. It's unbelievable. And so this is a story of persistence and experimentation and figuring things out. And now it's Rolling Stone that seems a bit like a mountain of insignificance compared to this 70-year career at the top of what music is to most people.
And how did you've had a very interesting career. You've been a 19th century historian, you've been a speechwriter for president.
Yeah.
And I know you're a Beatles fan, a big one, and working on a story about the Beatles. How did you end up working with McCartney on this project?
Simple answer is I went to a Paul McCartney show in New Jersey
Okay.
about 3 years ago. And that there wasn't like a beam of light that came down from the heavens onto me. I just went like anyone else. But on the way back, I rode New Jersey Transit with an editor I know, a friend, and I had actually worked with him in some ways around history, which of course you do also. And you'll know the deeper historical references of this story, but this friend was the editor of the Yale historian Edmund S. Morgan, great historian of the 17th and 18th centuries. We're about as far from Paul McCartney as we can be. And his name is Bob Weil, the editor, and he and I rode back together, and he was asking me questions like, "Are you a Beatles fan? Do you love Paul?" And I was like, "Yes, and yes," and we had a nice time talking. And then a year later, he called and said, "I'm looking for an editor for a book project involving Paul McCartney and Wings. Would you be interested?" So I think that concert, there was maybe a shaft of light that came out of the heavens because I met the one person who could give me this job, and I'm so grateful because it was just it was in addition to being I hope rigorous and well executed, it was tremendous fun. And I know you love music too, and
Love it.
most of us keep it kind of in another part of our lives, but I here was finally able to do history work, and there are timelines and references to things going on, but inside a music book. So it was really very fulfilling.
Do you think of it at all just to combine your two hats as a story about the 1970s? I mean, is Wings a product of that decade with its economic turmoil, social protest? I mean, do you connect those two?
Yeah, I do. I mean, if you're looking for hard politics, you're not going to find it in Wings for the most part. Although their first single, "Give Ireland Back to the Irish," was actually pretty focused, edgy statement after um, a violent episode in Londonderry, Northern Ireland in 1972. Paul immediately writes the song and records it very quickly, and it was banned by the BBC. So that, that was topical. But I think they're closer to the zeitgeist of the 70s when we think about things like feminism, and they are a feminist band with a female co-leader, vegetarianism, just the fashions. Wings had great, funny, eclectic fashions and haircuts throughout the decade. Even the cover of this book, you held it up, but it just sort of
Yeah.
radiates 1970s color in a way. So yeah, I found it very much the story of the 70s. That came naturally to me because I was getting into the age of listening to records in the 70s. So for me, it's like a personal journey across the decade. And they just were always on AM and FM radio. So every top 40 hit that's described in the book, I vividly remember.
Funny for young. I mean, they're a radio band too, which
Yeah.
us was something natural, but the kind of place you heard them, which was often physically outside your home, or the way you heard radio music over and over again. It's just such a different experience than it is streaming on Spotify. It's kind of
Yeah, and some of
similar.
those movies about the 70s, like Dazed and Confused, they capture how incredibly important music was to a teenager in the 70s. I mean, it still is, but there was something about the shared knowledge and talking with your friend by your locker going into high school about the concert you saw the previous week. It was like a secret language. It was very important.
And the arena rock amplified that because so many
Yes,
people were going, and it
yes,
became an event. Were you there? Were you not there? And a band like Wings becomes part of your character if you
exactly.
connected to it. We're almost out of time, but I had another question before I do. I always thank all my subscribers for the long view for joining us when this is released, and paid subscribers I always thank for supporting these kinds of great conversations. And I hope some of you might consider becoming paid subscribers to the long view. Um, the book reads really well. It's not always the case with lots of interviews. It can often be overwhelming. This is very skillfully done, and it reads like a really well done nonfiction story as you move through it. How did you think of putting this together so that it was both accessible, comprehensive, and had the feel of people speaking instead of you being the voice or Paul McCartney being the voice?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. And it was a strategy. We had a number of meetings at the beginning, a lot of transatlantic Zooms with people from London coming in to talk about it with us, and the editor, Bob Weil, and I here in the US. And we had one big advantage. We had thousands of words from transcripts of interviews for the forthcoming documentary. And one very wonderful surprise that I found out about later was Paul didn't want me to have access to that documentary. I kept asking, and they'd say, "Oh, we'll get it to you soon," and they never did. And I was frustrated. And later, Paul says this in his introduction. He wanted me to come up with something different from the documentary. So he purposely did not let me see it. But we had a story. It's a story of a band and of a family and of an individual artist and his growth over the decade. And so we knew roughly where we wanted it to begin around 1970 and roughly where it would end. And the themes of the story just became evident through reading all those huge amounts of words in the transcripts. Um, I like oral history just as a genre. I remember being much affected by a book about Edie Sedgwick, the 1960s Andy Warhol figure. It's just called Edie. It came out in the early 80s, and it reads like a page turner, like you said. There's a history of New York City punk rock called
Oh yeah,
Please Kill Me.
yeah,
Great book. That so those books were on my mind, and I just thought if it's skillfully done, if you think about where each quote begins and ends, and then it's like a jigsaw puzzle, you put in the next quote that follows the thought, you can do it. And it does read pretty. I thank you for saying that. Um, we wanted to add little bits of writing that came from me just to explain where you are in the story
yes.
that are in italics. But I think the format of oral history is a pretty good format.
And I'll just add, and the photos are just amazing that you have in here, and people when they buy it will see you
Thank you.
put together a nice collection. So, as a fellow historian, rock and roll fan, this is like a dream come true to work with and about one of your favorite musicians, and you did it incredibly well, Ted Widmer.
Thank you, Julian.
People, this is a great present book. Paul McCartney Wings, the story of a band on the run. I urge all of you to take a read. Thanks for joining the long view.
Thanks a lot, Julian.
Bye bye.
Bye.